Hey everyone, Jim Fitzpatrick. Thanks so much for joining me on another edition of Inside Automotive right here at the CBT Automotive Network. The ripple effects of the tariffs will hit dealers, OEMs, and consumers alike. Joining us now on Inside Automotive is John Murphy, Senior Autos Analyst at BofA Securities, to help us make sense of all of this. So John, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule there at BofA to talk to us a little bit about this tariff situation that dealers and OEMs are faced with today.
Great. Thanks for having me, Jim. I appreciate it.
Sure. So let's start first with the consumers situation. Is it applying much pressure? Are you seeing that the tariffs putting much pressure on the consumers yet, or is it more of a situation that we hear about on media and it hasn't quite hit the consumer yet?
Well, I think what you've seen with the March and April data on new vehicle sales is the consumer is having a mild freak out here on their concern about how much vehicles how much more they would cost with tariffs in the coming months. So you had a 17.8 SAAR at March. So there's a big surge at the end of the month, and it sounds like April is running pretty strong. Will probably be north of 17 million units again on a run rate basis. So I think they are they're attuned to this, but it does seem like that's petering out a bit, and folks are becoming a little bit less concerned about it. Actually, despite all of us in the media and in the finance community really focusing on it, so I think you've seen this surge, some of the release of pent up demand, which we think is north of 10 million units, structurally or cyclically. So I mean, there's been a bit of a freak out, but it hasn't really done a lot of damage to parts and service, the used business, and you've seen the surge in new vehicle sales. I think it's probably going to be June or July, where we see some inventory shortages potentially building, where the consumer will notice the inability to get what they want at a dealership. Right. And that's where there could be some real consternation for the auto consumer.
Sure. That was actually my next question. How quickly could dealers and OEMs start feeling the supply chain pinch here?
Yeah, so I think on dealership lots, given that we're sort of in the mid 50-day supply range, I think you'll start seeing some real shortages of vehicles that people want in June, and then in July we could run into some reasonably absolute shortages. JLR, Audi, Porsche, where there's there's not shipments coming in, at least at the moment. We'll see in the next couple of weeks, if that changes. But I think that's where you things really start hitting in the supply chain and at the automaker level. It's still a big TBD. We're looking at some resolution soon on auto parts that are USMCA compliant, and how they will be tariffed.
Right.
There's still a lack of certainty as to how the USMCA compliant vehicles that are crossing the border between Canada and Mexico are actually being tariffed, because the tariffs aren't even being collected at the moment, even though they started theoretically on April 3rd or at the beginning of April.
Yeah.
So they're being tariffed, but they're not being collected at the moment because nobody knows exactly how to measure them. So uncertainty really reigns here. But then I think you get into the supply chain, and that's where things could get quite a bit wonky. Tier 1 suppliers are well capitalized. Tier 2 and 3 are not that well capitalized.
Yeah.
So as you get volatility in schedules, or maybe they go down materially, you could see some failures there. And as we all know, I mean, it takes thousands of parts to make a vehicle, and all you need is one or two to really take down a production line. So I think we might see some odd disruptions that are COVID style supply shocks on various parts just not showing up at factories, and production going down, and that's very hard to predict. But I think we could see some of that coming in June, July, and August as well.
Yeah. What's your overall take on bringing manufacturing back to the U.S.? Is it a realistic long-term solution, or just a costly pivot?
So I think anybody that would argue against bringing back jobs to the U.S. would probably be a little bit irrational, right? I mean, bringing back jobs to the country sounds like a great idea on a first derivative basis. So, I'm certainly all for that. The reality is we have a fairly low unemployment rate in the United States right now, and I think all the auto dealers listening to us right now could certainly attest to the fact that they could use a few more technicians, right? I mean, we have a big auto tech shortage here in the country. So it seems like we probably have more of a skills gap than a need to add more jobs to the United States. However, when you look at the ability to bring assembly back at the automaker level, you can make the math work. This is, if you can find the folks, you look at operating costs, having about 10% of their component of operating costs being labor. You're not saving money in Canada. You're not saving money in Europe. you might be saving a little bit of money in Japan and some money in Korea. Certainly saving some money on assembly in Mexico. But the net of it is you could actually bring assembly back without really damaging profits and returns at the assembly level. On the parts side, it gets really difficult because we have a lot of suppliers right now, particularly on wiring harnesses that are being wound in Mexico.
Yeah.
They're talking about the need to offshore that out of Mexico because labor costs are too high in Mexico at the moment, and push that to Honduras. So the
Wow.
idea, that we could really bring a lot of parts back to the United States,
Yeah.
cost effectively with adequate returns, is in my mind a bit suspect. In reality, we get also back to this question of, do we have the bodies and the folks that really want and need these jobs? And the reality is we don't really. So I mean, I think there's a case to be made on the assembly side. On the parts side, it gets really hard.
Yeah, exactly. And of course it's interesting. The UAW Fine is all excited about this because he's thinking, we're going to be bringing all of these factories back, and of course it just boosts up the membership of the UAW theoretically. What's your take on that?
Well, I would guess most of these new factories or expansion capacity would largely happen in southern states that are a little friendlier to corporates and maybe a little less friendly to unions. So I think that's probably the first order of business is where you would put new capacity in place. But I also think you're going to look at, once again, because you have a shortage of folks, increasing levels of automation as much as possible. And with labor costs going higher and tariff costs going higher, sort of the substitution of making a decision on committing capital versus hiring a worker and having the flexibility starts to shift in the direction of actually committing the capital and having more automation. So I think, the net job gains is not necessarily let's take a worker out of Stuttgart, Germany, and put them in, Memphis, Tennessee. That's not going to be a one for one trade. So the job expectations are probably quite a bit, overblown. I mean, we have estimates of it. If you brought all those 8 million jobs back to the United States, you could add more than 1 million jobs. But the reality is you wouldn't add that many because you would automate a fair number of them and try to do things much, much more efficiently.
Right. I had one of your colleagues on in the industry, and he said to me that the high watermark for profitability of dealerships was in 2022 due to the COVID situation. That was also the same year that the industry had a SAAR of around 13 million vehicles. So theoretically, he said we can sell less vehicles in retail automotive and make more money. Now, I know there's some other extenuating circumstances, such as interest rates and checks being sent to every consumer during that period of time. But what's your take on that? Do you think that's a possibility that we may see more dollars being made on less new vehicles sold?
But I think that's possible. I think that the risk here is that costs are inflating. So in COVID, we had a supply shock. So you were forced to focus on fewer higher margin vehicles. You had some cost inflation, but here we're seeing cost inflation either coming from the tariffs directly or indirectly higher cost manufacturing in the United States. So your costs are really kind of inflating. So I would say dealer invoice prices will go up more than they did in that COVID-induced supply shock. So the room to make higher gross per unit is a little bit more challenged than it was back then going forward if we have lower sales. So I think you probably could do better at a lower SAAR rate than a 17, 18 million unit peak. But I think a 13 to 14 million unit SAAR would be something that wouldn't be great. And I think everybody who's listening probably is always salivates when you talk about UIOs, right? I mean, the more units you have in operation, the better you have, a parts and service business, which you want fixed ops to absorb all your costs. And
right.
That's something that, if you sell fewer new vehicles, you're not feeding the beast in the back end, and you really want to feed that beast as much as you possibly can. That's
right. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about the stocks. From your perspective, how are automaker and supplier stocks reacting so far? And what's your forecast for that?
So it's incredibly challenging to forecast aggregate sales and then run that through the models and come up with accurate earnings estimates at the moment. So kind of like CEOs of auto companies and CEOs of dealerships, and there's kind of a little bit of freeze on capital allocation towards any stocks, and certainly auto stocks at the moment because there's such extreme uncertainty.
Yeah.
I think as we get through this over time, we'll sort out, and we'll probably have some pretty good winners. At GM and Ford, probably Ford more than GM more directly at the moment, but we'll see where this all shakes out. I think the suppliers will be okay, but the dealer stocks continue to be our favorite structural part of the automotive value chain, and kind of like we said before, I think the dealers are going to come out of this stronger and leaner than going into it. And the dealer model will prevail.
Yeah, for sure. From your perspective, what should dealers be watching for in terms of demand shifts?
So I think it's going to be this is a unique time where it's going to be very brand specific and an understanding of does JLR decide to eat some of these increased tariffs and try to pass through some of the costs to keep their volume going. BMW and Daimler seem like they're kind of maintaining price at least through the end of May as we know it right now. And kind of forging ahead. But I think understanding what's going on with each individual brand is going to be important. But I think you got to also have to take a step back and say, okay, costs are going up here. We're going to see the companies focus on higher priced, higher trim level vehicles, so that the automakers are, so they can make money. Dealers should do okay in that. But then you also think what gets lost in the shuffle there, and that's the entry level vehicle. And I think that's where there's going to be a massive chasm in the market. So the first order of business for I think dealers there is to grow their used business in late model vehicles, and they might have to go older in the age spectrum. Really good high quality vehicles in the 7 to 10 year old segment still. So I mean, you have to work on the figure out how you recon those.
Sure.
But then also pay attention to the brands that are going to be entering the U.S. market. And I think over time, there's a chance that Trump strikes a grand bargain with Xi and Geely and Chery, and we'll see who else lands here in the United States. You'll see a fair number of Chinese manufacturers enter the U.S. by producing here, sourcing here, and employing Americans, and they may be the answer to the entry-level vehicle. So I would say keep an ear to the ground as to this, this potential new entry of the Chinese much sooner than people thought, prior to this tariff situation. And I think that's a real potential opportunity to grow over time.
Sure. I interviewed Michael Dunn recently. As you probably know, he's kind of the foremost authority on all things China for the auto industry. And he said that we are on an island in North America and that China vehicles are throughout the entire world. They're going after it in a very big way. And to your point, if a deal is struck where they open up a factory right here in the U.S., we could see a number of those Chinese vehicles on the roads, right?
Absolutely. I think it's also important to take a step back and recognize historically in the auto industry, the two places you've made money is in North American trucks and global luxury.
Yeah. And
entry-level vehicles have never really made anybody much money, no matter what the propulsion system is here. So I think that when you look at this as an automaker right now, and also as a dealer, focusing on North American trucks and luxury will prevail over time, and that's where the real consistent opportunity is going to be. Certainly growing with the entry level, if the Chinese come in and then kind of work up the chain to sort of mid-level and ultimately maybe luxury vehicles of their own sort, it might be an opportunity. So I certainly wouldn't dissuade you from that. But I think kind of that constant refrain of North American trucks and global luxury is where the money is. Yeah,
maybe dealers should be getting their letters of request for franchises of BYD in sooner rather than later.
I would certainly keep your ear to the ground and pay attention to that, because I would say I think it's probably sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I agree. John Murphy, Senior Autos Analyst for BofA Securities. Thank you so much for stopping by. I really appreciate it.
This is going to be a moment in time that's constantly in flux. So happy to come back, Jim. I appreciate the time.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thanks for watching Inside Automotive with Jim Fitzpatrick.